Before we start this video, a large thank you to Gustav, Gins, Zaphid, Lynn, Uzandre, Brennan, Zornhut's Journey, and Tim for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody, today we're going to make our first weapon items. So to do that, we have to actually make the base class for items, which we're also going to do. I'm going to start by dragging all my scripts into their appropriate folders to keep everything clean. I'm then going to navigate to my scripts folder, and then I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call it items. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a script which will act as the base class for every item we place into this game. I'm just going to call it item. So let's open this up and let's delete the start and update functionality as is tradition, and let's put it in our namespace. Now we have to think to ourselves, what does every item in the game have in common? What do they share in terms of data? Because this is the base class after all. So we're going to make a header first for the item information. And every item in the game, to my knowledge, has both a name and an item icon. So let's make a public string for the item name, and let's make a public sprite for the item icon. So what else do they have? Well, you could argue that every item probably has a description. So if you want to, you can make a separate little text header for that. But actually, I'm going to keep mine all under item information because that is technically still the same thing. I am going to use the text area component, so you get a bigger space in the inspector. And I'm going to say public string item description. What else does every item have? Well, in our code base, it needs to have an ID as well. So we're going to say public int. I'm going to use integer for my ID. I'm going to say item ID. Now, none of this is really important right now, but it's good to place it here just so it is there. And we're going to make this derived from scriptable object. Let's save this. All this will come in handy when we start making our UI, but we might as well make it since we're making the base class. So let's also make a weapon item, which will not be a base class, but it will be a class that our weapons inherit from. And let's make melee weapon item, because remember there's caster weapons, there's ranged weapons, and there's melee weapons. So basically weapon item will inherit from item, and melee weapon item will inherit from weapon item, which means it also inherits from item. So let's go and delete our start and update and add our namespaces. Let's make weapon item inherit from item. And let's do the same thing here, and let's make melee weapon item inherit from weapon item. So what's the difference between a melee weapon item and a regular weapon item? Well, for example, you can't buff, to my knowledge, or light like a bow on fire, but you can light your straight sword on fire, so that's one subtle difference. You can't cast spells with a melee weapon item unless you have the weapon art for it, but you can cast spells with a caster item, so that's why we make different classes for them. So what does every weapon item need? Let's go to the weapon item class. Well, every weapon item is going to have its own animator controller, which will override your current one, and it will basically be used when you're attacking with it to change animations. For example, you have a light attack 1 and 2. A mace's light attack is different than a straight sword's light attack, so when you use the light attack on the mace, it's going to change your controller briefly to the mace, and then if you use the straight sword, it will change it back to the straight sword. So, what else does every weapon have? Well, every weapon in the game has a weapon model, but not every item has an item model. For example, I think that talismans only have icon art. I don't think they have an actual model. Every weapon has weapon requirements, so let's put that in there as well. You need a strength level to wield it, a dexterity level, an intelligence, and a faith level. Now again, we're going to put all these in, but we're not going to worry about them right now. This will come across multiple episodes. You don't even have to put these in right now if you don't want. You can just comment them out, but I will add here. I will add them here, and I will just make FU as comments. We are going to basically go over weapons in the next few videos, and we're going to utilize all these variables in the next few videos. But today, we're only going to focus on getting the model to instantiate in the character's hand when you equip it. So, every weapon also has base damages. So you got your physical base damage, and then you have your fire, your magic, and your lightning, and your holy base damages. And these base damages are affected by other things. For example, your stat scaling, which we'll also get into in the future. But for now, let's keep it very simple. When we have our first iteration of hitting things with a melee weapon, we're just going to use the base damage. And then we're going to expand upon it further and further and further. But let's start off very, very simple and layer on the logic over time. So we also have weapon modifiers, which I won't make right now. Let's make it a comment. So for example, you get your light attack modifier, your heavy attack modifier, and these change the damage slightly. It uses the base damage and alters it. So a heavy attack is more powerful than a light attack, so you get a bit more modification on that. And then you have your critical damage modifier. So daggers are better for backstabbing, for example, and for riposting. But again, just going to leave that as a comment for now. I'll put in our stamina costs because we're going to use that very soon too. So we have the base stamina cost. I'll just say 20. We'll give it a random number. This is how much stamina you use when swinging the weapon. But then you have your stamina modifiers, which alter the base. So for example, running attack stamina might cost slightly more than a light attack stamina modifier. And I apologize if you guys hear noise in the background. My dogs are kind of just circling around behind me. So then you got heavy attack stamina cost modifier. Again, that's obviously more costly than a light attack. So we're going to just keep the base cost there for now. We'll add these modifiers later. Right now, they're just fine as comments. Then you have weapon deflection ratings, which I guess will be a melee weapon only thing. So I'll move that in a moment. That's basically if your weapon is going to bounce off another weapon that's blocking. So for example, if you one-hand attack with a spear against a great shield, a lot of times you play that recoil animation. But if you two-hand a great sword and attack a great shield, you don't play that. So we'll put that under the melee weapon item as a comment. But yeah, we're going to add that too. We don't need to put that in as a variable right now. Also, we have our header here, and I'll just make this for weapon base poise damage. So your weapon has poise damage. What is poise damage? Well, it determines if you're going to stagger somebody or not. If you have higher poise than the poise damage you're taking, then you won't necessarily play a damage animation that staggers you. Otherwise, you will. So every weapon has base poise damage. I'll put that as just 10 for now. And you also have an offensive poise bonus you get when you attack for some weapons, which briefly increases your poise while you're in the animation. I'll leave that one as a comment because that's much further in the future. So we'll keep that as a comment now as well. And if you guys see any of this and you're getting any ideas and you want to go and implement it yourself, I strongly encourage you to do so because that's a great way to learn. Worst case scenario, you change it when I come back around and do it myself. And then you can alter it to my way if you prefer it. And if you prefer your way, cool, you can keep it. So every weapon also has item-based actions. For example, when you hit the RB button, there's an action. The RT button is an action. The LB and the LT buttons, there are actions. So I'll leave that as a comment for now because that's going to be when we implement our item-based action system, which again, very, very close in the future, but we can't put any variables to that right now. You also have your Ashes of War and then your blocking sounds, and I'll leave those as comments as well. And you also have your guard absorptions, and I'll leave that as a comment until we do our blocking system. But the only thing we're going to get going first is creating the model, getting a damage collider on it, and then hitting each other. So worry about that. So next on the melee weapon, you can make one more comment here for can be buffed if you want, as I said earlier. But then let's create an asset menu name, so we can actually create these in our games. We'll say items/weapons/melee weapon. Okay, and then we can save that. So now we can create that. So let's do that. But first, let's go to our data folder. Let's make a new folder inside data. Let's make items, and let's make weapon items, just so we're sticking with the same naming conventions across all. The scripts and the data should be the same. So we got items, weapons. And then inside weapons, we can make a new folder for melee weapons. And then we can create our first weapon. So I'm going to create items, melee weapon. And then I'm going to call it straight sword. So you can fill in these if you want to. For example, the item name straight sword, the item description, a straight sword, but this won't matter until we have the UI, but I encourage you to fill it in now. It's nice to do that. I'm also going to create a new folder inside UI sprites for icons, and then I'm going to make one for items, and then for weapon items, and then for melee weapon items if you want. And I'm going to drag in an icon I have made here ahead of time. This isn't necessary right now because there's no UI. When we get to UI, I'll show you how I make my icons, but I'm just going to do it so it's here. And if you have an icon, you can go here and make sure you tick sprite and UI. And if you want to tick alpha is transparency, that gets rid of anything in the background that isn't present. So you have this clear image like this. And I'm going to drag my icon into here. I just took mine from Nephilim. But again, not important right now. Don't worry about it. Item description, again, this doesn't matter right now. There's no UI, but I'm just going to say a straight sword. So in the future, there will be a description. And the weapon model, this is important. Now, I have a pack of straight sword models here. You can get these from our asset shop if you want, but there are plenty of free ones on the Unity Asset Store, like so many. So I'll just drag whatever model you have now into the scene, and I'm going to rename it to whatever I want my weapon model to be. So I'll call mine weapon underscore straight sword. I'll say underscore 01 in case I have multiple. I'm going to right click and unpack this prefab completely and make it its own prefab. And I'm going to give our weapon prefabs their own folders. So go to data, prefabs, right click, create a new folder again, items, then weapon items, and then melee weapon items if you'd like. I'm just keeping the conventions the same, so it's always easy to find anything. If you want to look for the scriptable object, you know where it is. If you want to find the icon, you know where it is. If you want to find the prefab, you know where it is. Okay, so I'm going to drag it in, create a prefab, and that looks good. So let's delete this from the scene now. And now let's go and look for our straight sword scriptable object, and let's drag this model into the model section. Now, As I stated before, our goal is to take this model here and put it in our player's hands. So I'm just going to give it some strength and dex requirements and some base physical damage and some poise damage. But again, none of this matters right now, not important. So don't feel the need to do it if you don't want to. The only thing that matters here is that you have that weapon straight sword model inside that model variable. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, we need a couple things. We need an inventory to keep track of which weapon we're holding. And then we need an equipment manager of sorts to load the models on and off when we're changing them. So I'm going to make a player inventory manager script, and I'm going to make a player equipment manager script. And obviously we're going to make the base classes for these two, just in case in the future we want some logic that will be applied universally to everybody who inherits these classes. I'm going to drag them above my audio source and character controller because I think the layout looks a lot neater and I'm a little bit weird about that stuff. And I am then going to go over into the scripts folder. I'm going to go to character, I'm going to go to player, and I'm going to drag these two new scripts right in here immediately. And then I'm going to create my base classes in the character folder. So again, character inventory manager and character equipment manager. So we're going to do the thing then where we open these scripts and we're going to delete the start and update functionality and drop in our namespaces, and then we can write the logic to load the weapon models in our character's hands. So let's go and open these up, character inventory and character equipment manager. And all I'm going to do first is I'm going to make a reference to public weapon item. Now you could do this on the character inventory manager. Let's put a namespace too. So you could put public weapon item here, left weapon and right weapon. But here's the thing. Not every monster in your game or AI may have a left and right-handed weapon. Maybe some AI don't have any weapons at all, like dogs, for example. So for that reason, I'm actually going to take this from the character inventory manager and place it on the player inventory manager. We will make AI in the future that mimics the player character, but not all AI will mimic the player character. So for that reason, I'm going to put this over here on the player inventory manager, drop in my namespace. So we'll worry about the player right now. Let's go over to the player equipment manager, delete the start and update functionality, do the same, drop in our namespace. And you want to make sure you inherit these classes from their respective classes as well. So I'm going to put in my two weapon items here on the player inventory manager, current right-hand weapon and current left-hand weapon. Now let's minimize this and go back into the scene here. So as I say, you want to take this weapon model and you want to somehow get it into the character's hands. So if I were to drag my player model in the scene here, if I were to go down here and go to the root, hips, spine, if you're using the same model as me, it's probably the same if you're not. Go to hand, you want to drag the model in here. So you want to get this to happen. You want the model to appear in their hand. That way, wherever their hand moves, the weapon follows with the animation. So what we want to do is go to the hands, wherever you want the weapon to pop up, and let's add some kind of script to control popping on the weapon for us. We'll call it weapon model instantiation slot. So this is going to, wherever you have one of these scripts, it's going to just pop a weapon onto the location that you have the script for us. So maybe you got one on the back, maybe your hips when you're not wielding the weapon that you currently have. Wherever you want to instantiate a model, this script will do it for us. So let's say a namespace SG, or whatever your namespace is. And then inside of this, I'm going to make a comment here. Like, we need to know, what slot is this? Is this the left-handed slot? Is this the right-handed slot? Maybe you're putting a weapon on your back because you're two-handing your other weapons. Maybe this is the back slot. Regardless, we need to know what slot this is, and that's very simple. The only other thing we need is we need an actual game object to place on this slot. So the current weapon model that this slot has. And then we need two functions, one for destroying the weapon model and unloading it, and the other one for placing it into the slot properly and loading it. So let's make a public void for unload weapon model, and then a public void for load weapon model. And unload is simple. If current weapon model does not equal null, just destroy it. That's it. Now, right below it, let's make public void load weapon model. This one is also simple. What we want to do is make sure we're parenting the weapon at this specific place and then resetting all of its transforms. So for this, we require a game object. We need a weapon model. And when we pass this function a weapon model, let's make the current weapon model the one that we're passing. And then let's say weapon model dot transform dot parent is equal to this transform. And then we want to reset the rotation, the scale, and the position. We do that by saying weapon model dot transform dot local position equals vector 3.0. It's important you say local here. Weapon model dot transform dot local rotation is equal to quaternion dot identity. And then we're going to say weapon model dot transform dot local scale is equal to vector3.1. Okay, now that that's done, we need to go over to our enum script and add a new enum so we can identify which slot this is being used on. So let's go over here right in our character slot. Let's make a public enum, and I'm just going to call this weapon model slot. So it's just going to keep track of which slot is which, and right now we only need two, right hand and left hand. You can make a comment here for the future if you want. If you want like right hip slot, left hip slot, maybe your back slot. You can move the weapon models around when you're two-handing your other weapon. But for now, just right and left hand. We'll keep it simple. We'll come back to this when we do two-handing. So let's make a public, and let's call our enum type we just created. So I already forgot it. Probably weapon model instantiation slot. No, that's not it. That's the name of the script. Weapon model slot. Let's copy this and paste this here. And we can just call that weapon model slot, or whatever you want to call it, as long as you know what it is and it's clear to you. I'm just going to call mine weapon slot. So let's save that. Now, go into your game here and put one of these on the right hand and on the left hand, wherever you see fit, and make sure you give them their proper enum. So, for example, when I add one to the left hand, I'm going to change it to left hand slot. Now, let's go back into our player equipment manager, and what we want to do is make a public weapon model instantiation slot, right hand slot, and then make another one for our left hand slot. Okay, so we need a way to get these automatically. You could just drag them in the inspector, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to the character equipment manager, and I'm going to make first I'm going to add in my namespace, and I'm going to make a protected virtual void awake, and I'm going to override it on my player equipment manager. First, I'm going to make this derived from our character equipment manager, so I can even do that. I'm going to make my player inventory manager derived from my character inventory manager. And the reason why I'm overriding the awake again, as I've said before, is because in the future, if I want any logic to be universal across both, I need to call both the awake method on the character equipment manager and the awake method on the player equipment manager, so it gets its own logic. This is so, again, if I want to come back and add things that's applicable to everybody who inherits this class, it's easy. So I'm always going to keep that there. So we always call the base.awake. And now I am going to reference a way to get our slots. So let's make a private void initialize slots, or initialize weapon slots. And this is going to be super simple because we have them labeled with an enum, and there's only one of each. So let's just call this function right here now in awake. And what we do is we are going to say weapon model initiation or instantiation slots, an array, and we'll just call this weapon slots, is equal to get components in children. And we're going to look for every single weapon instantiation slot script we have on this game object that's a child. And then we're going to sort through them. So for each one that we found, so for each weapon slot that we found in our weapon slots, so every one that we found that's a child object, we're going to say if weapon slot dot weapon slot, as in the model slot type, is equal to, and then we want to search for, we'll start with our right hand slot. So we'll say weapon model slot dot right hand slot. Then we want to say, okay, if it's a right hand slot, we're going to say this specific weapon slot is now our right hand slot. So we'll say right hand slot is equal to this specific weapon slot. Then we can say else if for this one that we're searching through in our list of weapon slots, if it's a left-handed slot, then we say, okay, our left-handed slot is equal to this specific slot. So very simple. We're just iterating through a list, and we're looking for them, and then we're just assigning each slot to their respective slot. So now that's done, that should automatically populate for us. We're going to make a public void. We can make load both weapons on hands, and then we can make a load left and load right weapon singularly, because in the future you might not want to call both every time. If you're switching one weapon, for example, you don't want to refresh the others in case you have one weapon buffed or something. You want to reset the buff or reset the model. So let's just make both for the start, because when you start the game, you want to load both in your hands when the game starts up. And let's make a separate one for each. So load right weapon and then load left weapon. So what are we doing here? Well, we need to use our new instantiation slots to populate a model in each hand. So first on load weapons on both hands, let's call load left and right. Now, what do we do in load left and right? Well, we got to check to see if there is a weapon in our player inventory. And for that, we got to reference our player manager so we can access our player inventory from there. And then we need to go to our player manager and actually make a script, or sorry, a variable for our player inventory. Let's hide it in the inspector because we don't need to see it. Let's make a public player inventory manager and call it player inventory manager. And let's use awake, and since it sits on the same game object as the player manager, we're just going to use get component and then reference the player manager variable. So now we can reference our player inventory manager from our player manager, which allows us to access any weapons we may have on our player inventory manager. So let's go back to load right weapon and load left weapon. We'll start with load right weapon. We're going to say if player.playerinventory.manager.current right weapon does not equal null, so we check for null in case there's nothing there, and then we will call our right hand slot dot load weapon, and we pass the current right hand weapon dot weapon model. Now, this is likely going to give us an error because we're not instantiating the game object. We're trying to directly reference an asset in the game. So before we continue with this, we're going to just paste this here first, but we're going to come back and actually instantiate a copy of it, because like everything in the game, you should always use copies of prefabs and never try to reference the direct asset in your project, because that's going to give us some problem. Because for example, when we try to destroy it, instead of destroying an instantiated copy, it's going to try to destroy the actual prefab, which will give you a problem. So before we do that, let's go over to character equipment manager. Let's make a virtual void start, and let's go over here and override the start on our player equipment manager. We're just doing this so we can call load weapons on both hands to make sure this works. After that, you can save it, and then what we want to do is go back into our project and actually save our player on the prefab, because I've just added those two scripts to it to instantiate the weapons. And then we can delete the player from the scene here and put a straight sword in each of the weapon slots, the right and the left hand. Now, before we continue, let's jump back over to our player equipment manager, and let's make two new variables for game objects. Let's call this right hand weapon model and left hand weapon model. So we're saving the localized variable here of the game object we want to instantiate. And then down under load right weapon, we're going to say right hand weapon model equals instantiate. And then we're just going to instantiate the player inventory dot current right hand weapon model. We do this again so we're not trying to mess with the actual asset in the project. We're creating a copy of it, because when we try to destroy it, we want to destroy the copy, not destroy the actual asset in the project. So then instead of load weapon from the current right hand weapon, we just say load weapon right hand weapon model. Then do the same for the left hand, and that's it. Now it should work. I'm just going to quickly rename right to left and save this. Okay. Oh, I see a mistake. I referenced right hand here twice. So let's see. There we go. Let's save that. Current light, no, current left. Now we save. Should work. Okay, so we go into play mode now. And if you load one of your slots, it should work the same as starting a new one, because we've edited the prefab with those weapons. We go in here, and I'm just going to load a random character, and I jump into the scene, and yes, so there are two swords on my hands, but they look pretty terrible. So what do we do from here? Well, there's a couple options. Sometimes animations edit a prop bone to adjust the straight sword position for you, which is what we do in Nephilim, but there's a much simpler way. We're going to basically just get the sword where you want it to be. And if you have our straight sword animation set, you can actually just copy the component transform from there, because we have it exactly where it should be. I'm just going to eyeball it for now. When it looks good, right click on the transform, copy the component, and then stop the game. And what we want to do now is take out our weapon prefab and drag it into the scene view here. So I'm just going to say weapon underscore straight sword, and let's unpack the prefab completely. So right click, prefab, unpack completely. Let's right click, and then we're going to create an empty parent. And I'm going to name this weapon underscore straight sword underscore 01. And then I'm going to create another empty game object under the parent. And I'm going to call this weapon pivot. And then I'm going to drag the model in the pivot and rename this to weapon model. Now we can paste the transform values on the weapon pivot, right click, paste component values. And now we save this over the original prefab and overwrite it. Now what happens is, basically, if you want it to fit a certain way in your character, you just adjust the transform of the pivot. You can see for the right hand that looks fine. Now the left hand still looks bonked because it's a mirror of the right hand, so this isn't going to work. Now the solution here is very simple to what we just did for the pivot. What we want to do is go to the actual place where we instantiate the left-handed weapon. We want to give it its own little game object and change the value of that. So if I jump back over here to the weapon model instantiation slot script, you can see whatever weapon model we have, we're parenting it under the object of the script. So with that logic, let's go to our player model, and let's open up the prefab and go to the left hand. I'm going to remove the script from the left hand because I don't want to mess with this game object. I want to give it its own. So I'm just going to basically remove it from here and create a new empty game object under it. And I'm just going to call this weapon model instantiation slot, or left hand instantiation slot, whatever you want to call it, as long as it's clear to you, it doesn't really matter. So let's take the script and move it from the left hand, and let's just move it down here on this slot. And now, like we just did, make sure you put left hand here on the weapon slot. Like we just did with the weapon pivots, we're going to use this object as a pivot for the left hand. So we go to scene, click on your sword here, and go to this specific weapon instantiation slot, and just basically change the transforms until it looks good to you. And then you want to right click and copy the component, and then go back to the prefab and paste it just as we did before. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this right now. I might spend some time tweaking it off camera because, you know, as long as you know how to do it, you don't need to watch me and just sit here for 30 seconds or a couple minutes to get the exact value. So right click, copy component, stop the game, go to your prefab, open it up, go back down to the slot and right click on the transform, paste component values. Now, when we start the game, we should go into the project and you should see the swords loading, and yes, there they are, looking nice. So guys, I know there was a lot of variables in this video that we're not using right now, but I'm placing them because in the next series of videos, so we're going to make it so we can basically use our weapons to damage each other, and we're going to expand upon previous systems like the take damage character effect, and we're going to create some new systems as well, but we're going to really focus in now on the basic version of the combat so we can get a simple gameplay loop going. So then in the next episode, we're going to continue work on our weapon system. We're going to make it so weapons have damage colliders, and we're going to utilize our damage variables that we've created in this video. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. A like and a comment are always appreciated. I'm really excited to continue this, and of course, I will see you guys next week. I hope you all have a lovely weekend.